On May 18th, 2021, CNI was honored to host a spectacular panel of experts who brought different vantage points to the table to share their insights and perspectives on the role negotiation and failed negotiation has played in the humanitarian crisis playing out at borders across the globe. We asked each panelist to spend 10 to 15 minutes sharing their insights with us and then opened up the conversation for questions from participants. Our first panelist was Professor Elizabeth Ferris. Professor Ferris is a research professor with the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University. In 2016, she also served as senior advisor to the UN General Assembly's Summit for Refugees and Migrants. She has written extensively on humanitarian issues, and her latest book is entitled Refugees, Migration, and Global Governance, Negotiating the Global Compacts. Without further ado, here's Professor Ferris.
Many of them embarking on rickety boats to cross the Mediterranean. Some of you may remember the photos, those chilling photos of little Alan Kurdi washed up on a beach as symbolic of the desperation with which many people were using every means necessary to try to find safety. So while this was playing out, this came to be known as the European migration crisis, although I wonder about the use of the term crisis. There were about 1.2 million people who arrived that year in Europe, which is a lot of people, but Europe has 700 million population. It isn't the same as for Lebanon, which has 5 million people to have 1 million arrivals, but nonetheless, it was perceived as not only a European migration crisis, but as a global crisis. And I hope in the discussion we can talk about how these narratives come to be. Why was Syria, with large numbers of refugees, say total about 5 million refugees, seen as a global crisis, whereas Venezuela, which has seen 6.5 million people leave its country, is seen mainly as a Latin American or a regional crisis. But in any event, in Europe, there was a perception that there was a crisis, and indeed globally. And so for the first time ever, the UN General Assembly decided to host a summit to address large movements of refugees and migrants. This was the first time the UN had organized such a global special meeting to deal with refugees and migrants. And certainly refugee and migration advocates around the world were excited about this possibility. I mean, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to set new normative standards, for example, regarding the way in which migrants and refugees are treated. There was also some fear, however, because the trend then, as now, was for governments, particularly of rich developed countries, to close their borders. So there was a fear that maybe reopening this discussion could lead us to be even worse off. So the UN, the Secretary General, set up a small secretariat to plan for this summit. And just through kind of a quirk of fate, I was asked to come and help out with the secretariat. I was seconded by my university, and UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, provided a little bit of funding so I could live in New York while I worked there for a year. And it was, for an academic, it was an amazing experience. I was tasked with drafting the Secretary General's report. Now, I don't know how many of you are academics, but for an academic to write a 20-page paper is really nothing. We can do it on a weekend. But this was a different process. This was a consultative, negotiated process where we had inputs from about 80 different governments, each of them insisting, this is what we want to see in the report. And then we had a very intense drafting process with about 25 UN agencies, World Bank, Red Cross, a lot of different organizations who would go through the various drafts we produced and make extensive changes. So in a sense, it was really quite tedious work. The draft went through 4 drafts with comments in track changes from 25 people for each draft to incorporate those. And so, as a drafter, the point was to make sure that everybody felt that their views were represented, to have even a phrase from every government, to have every UN agency. I remember one UN agency gave us 35 pages, single space of notes they wanted included in a 20-page report. But, you know, we got in one little phrase from that particular UN agency and they were thrilled. Oh, we're mentioned, we're acknowledged. So, you know, from a drafting point of view, that process of inclusion, so people felt like they were noticed. So the drafting went pretty well. Once it was out, then the UN General Assembly began negotiations. The negotiations themselves were led by two skilled UN diplomats, ambassadors of Ireland and Jordan, who very skillfully managed the discussion, identified points of tension, sought ways to minimize the differences, paper over them, go to the lowest common denominator when they could, for example. And by golly, by July of that year, the New York Declaration was passed. It was approved in the summit of 2019. There was a great feeling of jubilation. This New York Declaration was a human rights-based document. It very much called for development of new global compacts on refugees and migration. Just as an aside, I think the use of the word compact was particularly interesting, especially from a negotiating point of view, because, you know, nobody really knows what a compact is. You know, a convention, a treaty is binding, everybody knows, but what's a compact? Well, sounds vaguely legal, but not as demanding as a convention with obligations. And so I think just the use of those terms was really helpful in moving the process forward. So this New York Declaration was passed to great applause. Everybody was kind of amazed that somehow we got there. There were a few sticky points in those negotiations, mainly over the issue of detention of children. In the original document I drafted, it said detention should never be used for children for purposes of immigration, full stop. In the eventual text that was adopted, there were lots of qualifiers, unless absolutely necessary, for the shortest time possible, in accord with national laws. But it became a very convoluted sentence in English, but that was the result of the negotiation process. So September 2019, two processes on track for two new global compacts. And 6 weeks later, Donald Trump was elected president of the US. This put a real wet blanket on everything. Trump had been elected on a virulently anti-immigrant agenda. Even certainly under the Obama administration, maybe even today under Biden, there was a sense that the US could play a leadership role in these negotiations, but suddenly nobody else in the world wanted the US to play a leadership role in these negotiations. Trump made it very clear in his first weeks in office that the US would not be a party to development of the Global Compact on Migration. The US did stay in the process to negotiate the Global Compact on Refugees, really withdrawing at the very last minute, causing a lot of consternation from UNHCR and other officials who had made a lot of accommodations to keep the US in. And then at the last minute, the US pulls out, and then it's too late to renegotiate some of that text. Two very different negotiation processes for two very different compacts. Global Compact on Refugees was developed by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees on the basis of consultations, pointedly not negotiations, with governments and other affected parties. That there were regional meetings and consultations with particular groups and many, many meetings with governments. The Global Compact on Migration was negotiated in New York by diplomats who were primarily focused on peace and security issues. You know, historically, Geneva is the center for humanitarian work, and New York is for peace and security. And it was a very different process and a very different document. The process was, it was all negotiated by governments in New York. It too was adopted with great skill on the part of the diplomats overseeing that process. I'm particularly stand in admiration of the Mexican ambassador, Juan Jose Camacho, who is a brilliant diplomat in reconciling different interests. For governments of rich developed countries, border control, border management, returning rejected asylum seekers was key. For many in the global South, the issue of the rights of migrants had to be paramount. So Camacho said, in essence, hey, this is a package deal. You got to take it all. you rich countries, you got to take the migrants' rights. You countries that are really concerned with migrants' rights, you got to take a little bit of border control. So you presented this as a package. This is the best deal you're going to get. There's something in it for everyone, and there's something in it that everyone dislikes. But I think he did a brilliant job of negotiating this global compact on migration. It too was adopted unanimously, with the US not participating in New York. And then it went to an international conference in Morocco in December. And in that 6-month period, all kinds of controversies emerged. Governments were saying, oh, this implies a right to migrate. Let me stress, these are both global compacts were non-binding. They are not imposing any obligation on anyone, but there was a lot of controversy in the 6 months lead up to the global compact on migration. Both compacts were adopted by huge majorities in 2018. As non-binding agreements, they offer a roadmap, they're aspirational, but governments can pick and choose whether or not to follow them or which particular clauses to try to incorporate. Just to summarize, just a couple of lessons I learned in this process. And although I've worked closely with the UN over the years, this is the first time I worked for the UN, which was a very different experience. And it was a wonderful experience to see the way in which interests of very different countries can be brought together. But a few of the lessons I learned is, first, that the framing document is really important, regardless of whether or not governments reject it or change it, that the way the issues are spelled out in the beginning has an enormous consequence on the final product. Frankly, I thought it was helpful, and I heard from a number of people the same, to have somebody who was perceived as a neutral party doing the drafting. People would say, oh, that Georgetown professor is writing it. There's so much tension and turf battles between different UN agencies. It was really convenient to have somebody in that role who wasn't defending a particular territory. I think the General Assembly process of having the negotiations overseen by ambassadors, one from the global north, one from the global south, was a really good model. And the ability to pick people who were really skilled and respected by their colleagues. Most people think that having the US outside of the global compact for migration was probably good. That given the anti-immigrant policies of the Trump administration, if the US had been there, we probably would have ended up with a weaker document. So even though there was a lot of lip service giving to we want the US back in reality, a lot of the diplomats were very happy to negotiate. And just to say that these were negotiations over non-binding aspirational agreements. The process today for negotiating binding conventions imposing new obligations for states, I think, is almost impossible. Governments over and over said, we're happy to be a part of this, but we wouldn't be a part of it if it meant some obligation on our part. So I think this also says a lot about the nature of international law, that we're moving to a time when soft law and general principles are easier to achieve and maybe as effective in the long run as binding international agreements. So those are some reflections from my experience working with these UN level negotiations, and really eager to hear from our next speakers about different kinds of negotiations in the migration sector. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Beth. It's so interesting to get some insight on those negotiations, and really, I think, gives me a true appreciation for the accomplishment that is represented by those documents. And also, it's bittersweet to hear that these framework documents may be the extent of what we're able to accomplish internationally. Thank you. It is now a privilege to introduce Dulce Garcia. Dulce is the executive director of Border Angels, a nonprofit organization that conducts humanitarian work along the US-Mexico border. She herself is a DACA recipient who, along with fellow DACA recipients, formed San Diego Border Dreamers to advocate for more humane immigration laws and policies. And she is an attorney who has been spending a lot of her time as of late working on the ground in Tijuana, which is where we met with her last week virtually, but I believe she is back in San Diego today. And Dulce, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that's listening to this. These are very important conversations. I'm so glad that there are people from all over the world listening. Border Angels is very much engaged in direct action to defend rights of migrants and refugees. And some of our programs include our water drop program, where our water drop team goes into the desert to provide supplies, water, blankets, anything that might keep someone alive, either from freezing to death in the mountains or from dehydrating in the desert. We have our bond program that provides monetary support for those that are in detention, in immigration detention. Last year, we started this program and we were able to provide 69 bonds, 69 families that were reunited because of community efforts to get these folks out, especially during the pandemic, where we saw an increase of the amount that the US government was asking for the release of these mostly asylum seekers and mostly from African countries. The program that we have in Tijuana is to support 17 shelters. And so was it earlier, we were in Tijuana also supporting El Chaparral, which is an encampment in Tijuana, right at the port of entry. This photograph, this background here that I'm using for Zoom is actually a photograph that was taken a couple of weeks ago of the encampment, where we see 500 children sleeping in these tents, families, women, some pregnant women, single moms, and all of them without access to bathrooms, potable water, or food, very much dependent on donations from other civil organizations, churches, individuals from Tijuana and the US that come into this space to provide something, food, blankets, clothing. We also have our Green Card for Kids program because the US government does not provide immigration attorneys, even for kids that are presenting themselves as abandoned or abused or neglected by their own parents, and that might qualify for either asylum or special immigrant juvenile status that would allow them to stay here in the US. We have been able to fill in this gap once the kids become part or custody of the local state. Then we are able to collaborate locally and provide an immigration lawyer. And we've been successful in stopping the deportation of some of these kids and actually obtaining them a green card. One of the kids that we received a green card for this year, her first question was, well, do I get to go to college now? And again, this is work that is needed just because our policies are still very inhumane, that cause this need for us to have these policies or these programs to reduce the impact that the policies have on the ground. We hope that we don't have to do this work in the future, but today, every day, there are people dying attempting to cross the border. Our laws are very much focused on border enforcement instead of humanitarian aid. We believe these are failed negotiations of many years past as a result of Operation Gatekeeper or IRA in the 90s. That has created an undocumented community here in the US. There are statistics that say 5 million of us that are in the US undocumented are undocumented precisely because of these laws that were created in the 90s. And all of these deaths that we see, whether it's maritime attempted crosses or through the desert or rivers that we continue to see every day, is because of these failed negotiations. Things like the building of the wall with Operation Gatekeeper, the militarization of the border. And so these failed negotiations have created this humanitarian crisis, very much with the purpose of dehumanizing our migrant community. During the Trump administration, these policies were created in a way that were so inhumane that it would deter people from asking for asylum, right? We saw family separation as a tool to discourage people from around the globe to even consider, I think, about coming to the US. However, this administration, the prior administration, did not realize that folks were so desperate for survival that they would still show up at our doors, even when the policies were so inhumane. And we still see that impact on the ground from these failed negotiations still today during the Biden administration. Although the rhetoric has changed, we still see in this space, like I was talking about earlier, about in the Chaparral families, women deciding whether to send their children unaccompanied through the border. And we see an increase of unaccompanied minors because Title 42 is still in enforcement. Title 42 closed the door during the pandemic and said only essential travel is allowed. However, asylum was not considered an essential travel, and the doors remain closed to asylum seekers even today. And so we're past the 100 days from this Biden administration, and the promises that were heard around the globe that it would create a path for asylum seekers, that has not, that promise has not been fulfilled. And so that's why we have over 2,000 people in this space. And this is just one of the various ports of entry that we have in the US. But in Tijuana, we have seen 2,000 people waiting for the doors to open. And as they have been waiting, these are not newly arriving. These people have been waiting in Mexico, some for almost 2 years, some for many months. And they are now so desperate that they are living in these tents. We have talked to women that have lost their babies as they have waited in this very dangerous place in the streets. We have talked to women that have made the difficult decision of sending their teenager because they thought that the gangs present there would force them to join the gang and they would lose their children. And so they're very much in survival mode in this space, looking for some respite. Some folks that have made it across the border were put in detention centers. And the US government, still today with this administration, is at any given night putting 15,000 people in detention centers and asking for thousands of dollars for their release. It's incredible to think that this has been happening for so long, and we have created a system that private corporations are benefiting from the pain and suffering from asylum seekers in these spaces where every night, every bed that is occupied, a private corporation is making money. These, for example, these places like Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego County, we saw the first COVID-related death. And the corporation that runs it, Core Civic, is only accountable to ICE, but ICE is not accountable to anyone. And this is written in our laws. So Trump was very effective in creating a narrative that dehumanized us as migrants, as immigrants. And at the same time, these things that have been in place, these policies, these laws, these mechanisms for Trump to use was used in a very effective manner to terrorize our community. And they were in the books. So a lot of the pleadings were, with the Trump administration, and those failed. But a lot of these laws had been in place for so long. And so we know that we need to do better in the negotiations in DC. And one powerful tool for us has been our stories. I was fortunate enough, honored to offer testimony in Congress last month with a congressional hearing, a Senate hearing by Senator Sinema, where we offered testimony about all of these injustices that we're seeing at Chaparral and in the 17 shelters that we support that are still receiving today people that are being expelled by the Biden administration with the excuse of the border being closed and using Title 42 to expelled migrants. We denounce these things, and we hope that people in DC are listening. And we know as a DACA recipient, as someone that has been in the US undocumented for 33 years, I know the power of a good story. And I think that is what has gained us so much ground with our movement. We sued the president of the United States. You know, the complaint read Garcia v. Trump, but I know behind that complaint, there was a big community, hundreds of lawyers, so many private corporations in support filing amicus briefs, so many schools, from all over, all kinds of sectors providing support, because we were loud enough and brave enough to tell our stories and say we are undocumented and we want to stay here in the US. And it's exhausting. I'm not gonna lie, it's exhausting to try to convince the US public to see us as humans, to get away from this hateful rhetoric, especially heightened with the Trump administration, where they try to paint us as criminals, as lawbreakers, as not worthy of respect or dignity. And so in the last 20 years, we've done a lot of great work in putting our stories out there as much as we can. And we are still doing that today. A couple of DACA recipients, Dreamers, 6 of them actually, met with Biden himself this last week, again, telling our stories. And as I'm speaking right now, there are other meetings occurring, one with Pelosi's office in a few minutes, again, to tell our stories and the importance that comprehensive immigration reform would have, not only in our personal lives, but in our communities, and how good it would be for the entire country. And so that's one powerful tool that we have used, is telling the stories, whether it's an asylum seeker in Tijuana, whether it's our own very personal stories to tell. Because one thing that the Trump administration tried to do was use DACA as a bargaining chip. And we when we would present ourselves in DC, we would often hear from Democrats, well, go talk to Republicans, because they want to say that they want to give you a path to citizenship, but only in exchange for an increased militarization, only if we punish your parents by never letting them apply for citizenship, only if we get away from the visa lottery. And so the Trump administration had a long list of things that they wanted to. They would call them the 4 pillars of immigration. And they wanted to get away with that and say, we're going to protect dreamers, but only if we bring so much more harm to our border communities. And as border dreamers, as people that live in this border region and know the importance and how much more lives are being lost every day as a result of increased militarization in the wall, we said, no, we would rather remain undocumented than negotiate the safety of our own parents. And so this idea of having to convince people of our parents' humanity as well, and saying, you know, that's not even a good negotiation point to say we're going to protect dreamers, but then go after their parents. So the use of language that comes also with telling our stories has become another very important tool, and changing the rhetoric across the US and really across the globe to paint this crisis, as the Trump administration was referring to it, as more of a humanitarian crisis. No one wants to see drugs in our community or terrorism. No one wants to, you know, we can all be in agreement that we want our communities to be safe. But we also want to welcome migrants. We also want to create a system that is humane. And so I think the focus should be, instead of border enforcement, one of humanitarian aid, based on humanitarian principles. And I think that's how we're going to see a much better border, because the war on drugs has failed us, and so many other attempts to secure a border are failing. And what we're seeing on the ground is horrible injustices. So thank you again for listening to us, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Dulce, thank you so much. And thank you for the really critical work that you do. You know, the outcome of your work is to reposition you and the migrants and the people you represent from the place of being a bargaining chip to actually having a voice at the table. And it's critically important work. I know after our planning session, I have some guilt about naming this roundtable the role of negotiation in the migration crisis, because that framing just works to sort of underscore that this is a border crisis which needs enforcement rather than a humanitarian crisis which needs support and aid. And so just thank you so much for your critical work. And for enlightening me to that perspective as well. I am delighted now to introduce our next panelist, Stefan Jacquemet. Stefan is the Director of Policy at the International Catholic Migration Commission. Before joining ICMC, he spent 25 years with the UN Refugee Agency, with assignments in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. He also worked at the International Committee of the Red Cross as the delegate in Africa and the Middle East, and as a legal officer in Geneva. And he joins us from Geneva today. Welcome, Stefan.
Thank you, Krista, and really a pleasure to be with all of you. And I'm really honored to be on the panel you are moderating, and really a pleasure to be with Beth and Dulce. The privilege of being the third and final speaker is that I don't need to reinvent the wheel, and I can basically build my presentation on what my colleagues and predecessors have been saying. And I completely agree, fully agree with all what Beth has been saying, and indeed Dulce about her personal experience in the US. But I would like, if you allow me, to indeed build on what they just said, but also come back to the title of the webinar. And I think you alluded to that, Krista, just now, the role of negotiation in the migration crisis. I guess the migration crisis, which is mentioned in the title, is the current situation at the southern border in the US, but it could be a reference to any crisis, including the European crisis, as mentioned by Beth. But what I would like to say is that migration management is, let's say, a governance issue for most governments, is one issue among others. But the problem is that migration is never dealt with in a kind of rational, normal way. There is always passion, there is always emotions, and much worse than emotions, there is always manipulation. And one of the problems is that the migration narrative is to a large extent been dictated by the extreme right and populist movements. And these movements are often convincing governments, sometimes well-intentioned governments, that a difficult situation is a crisis. And also that some crises, when they are being resolved, still remain a crisis. And what is their interest to have, let's say, the certain situation being described as a crisis? Is that precisely in a crisis, the capacity to negotiate for NGOs, for the UN, for advocates, people, for migrants themselves, is very, very limited. So the space for negotiation is being reduced, and basically this is basically increasing the power and the influence of this extreme rights movement. To do that, I will give you a few examples, and basically they will be the same one as Bess and Dulce has been mentioning. And I will start with the European so-called crisis, the one in 2015. And I think Bess also mentioned that it was one of the questions to ask whether it was a real crisis given the numbers at stake. But it was indeed a political crisis in Europe. In 2014, we had 225,000 people coming to Europe through the Mediterranean. And suddenly in 2015, the number quadrupled, or basically was multiplied by between 4 and 5 times, reaching over a million. Over a million for all the European countries doesn't seem to be a lot, but it was because basically it split the European Union into a few countries willing to accept the people, and the vast majority of governments basically wishing to put in place measures to contain the movement and basically to close the borders. So a number of measures were taken. The first one was to make a deal with Turkey, a deal which was in many respects in violation of a number of human rights standards. And of course, the agreement on the Turkish side was to contribute to stemming the flow and to reducing the numbers. And of course, it had an impact because in 2016, 1 year later, the number went down from over 1 million to 375,000. So then a second thing happened in 2016, while the numbers had already been reduced, is that Italy struck a deal with Libya. So basically, again, a deal which was in violation with core human rights standards, and basically meaning that the Libyan Coast Guard would be involved in interception, which was called rescue at sea, which was, of course, a kind of a very positive narrative for a country which had an appalling human rights record. And basically, the people intercepted would end up in so-called reception center, which de facto were detention center. Then the following year, there was another element in the puzzle, which was basically a number of countries starting to challenge NGOs doing rescue at sea on the Mediterranean, including starting court cases against NGO workers involved in rescue at sea, basically saying that by rescuing people at sea, they were supporting basically smuggling rings and basically providing support to smuggling activities. That was complete bad faith, but to some extent it worked because, for example, a number of NGOs saw the funding for rescue at sea being very much reduced, and a number of rescue boats from NGOs being forced to stop their activities. Then the following year, in 2018, we had a government in Italy which included the extreme right, and the Home Minister was a member of that party, And basically, Italy decided to close all the ports to rescue boats. So the whole point is to say that both probably the real crisis in 2015 and then the artificial crisis, basically part of the narrative being controlled by a number of populist movements and politicians, led to basically in 2018, the NGOs, the UN, and all the other like-minded people being forced to negotiate things which were unthinkable in 2014. We had to negotiate for a boat with 200 people on board to be able to basically land somewhere, with people being forced to be on the Mediterranean without any country being willing to accept them for 3 to 4 weeks. And when you know the conditions for people to be on those boats, it's just appalling. So basically in 2018, the humanitarian work was basically to negotiate for 200 people to be accepted, while in 2014, 225,000 people were accepted without being anything being challenged. So again, I think that the humanitarian work done by NGOs around securing the possibility for these people to be rescued and to have a port accepting them is extremely important. And that should not be negotiated. Dulce's organization work is absolutely essential because it makes a huge difference for the people. But this is where we are when we maintain a kind of an artificial crisis, which is no longer the case, but which basically forces the NGOs and the UN and all the people of goodwill to basically be forced to limit themselves to negotiate the individual cases against good, healthy policies. Two very quick points, which are also examples of negotiations being limited or being expanded because we are dealing with a crisis or not, a real crisis or not a real crisis or an artificial crisis. The first example is exactly what Beth has been saying, the whole negotiation of the Global Compact. And she mentioned that the fact that the Trump administration withdrew from the process was probably a blessing. Because if the Trump administration had been in the room, the capacity to negotiate for the like-minded countries would have been very, very, very much diminished. The Global Compact would have been negatively influenced by the US administration at that time being in the room, and they would have imposed their narrative. And the whole negotiation would have been to try to salvage the little which could be salvaged. So I believe that Beth would really agree with me that that was a blessing. But it also shows that if you have a spoiler in the room dictating the narrative, then your capacity to negotiate is very much reduced. And my final example is indeed related to the US situation and what Dulce was saying and all the daily efforts to secure that people would have legal aid, would have access to territories, that family would be reunited, etc., etc. Basically, what is interesting is that among the promises from President Biden when he was a candidate was to basically accept in resettlement up to 125,000 people, to basically increase the quota, which was down to 15,000 with the Trump administration, to 125,000. And it was a given that the Biden administration would not go immediately to 125,000, but at least half that number would be a given for 2021. But on 14th of April, in large part because of the situation at the southern border and the pressure from different anti-migrant constituencies, the Biden administration basically said, we will keep the same Trump number, meaning 15,000. There was an outcry during 2-3 weeks and negotiation from NGOs, but also from people within the Democratic Party. And in 2-3 weeks later, the Biden administration said the new quota would be 62,500. This is a good example of how negotiation can have an influence on the outcome. In that case, it was really linked to the pressure from a number of organizations like Dulce's. So thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm very interested in this distinction that you draw between an artificial crisis and a true crisis, and the difference that makes in the way that the issue is negotiated, if it makes a difference at all. Maybe that's something that we can talk about a little more during these next few minutes. So we have a little over 20 minutes to have some discussion with our panelists. Please, if you have questions for the panelists generally or for an individual panelist, put your question in the chat box. I will, I'll get us started while folks are thinking. I'm wondering, it sounds, Stefan, you brought up a few instances where these negotiations unfortunately lead to even less than humanitarian policies. And Beth, you talked a little bit too about in your negotiations, observing these sort of lowest common denominator negotiations to get everyone on board. And so the outcomes are not always ideal, maybe oftentimes less than ideal. I wonder if you have seen any, maybe even bilateral negotiations between two countries that could serve more as a model to us. Have you seen any success stories or countries that maybe are getting this right? And maybe there are none. I mean, we're all sort of just fumbling through, but wondering if there is anyone that we can look to, any countries that we can look to say, okay, yeah, they're at least going in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's easier to negotiate something that's very general, principled, human, at the abstract level than when it comes down to actual negotiations over issues important to national interest. I mean, I'm struck by what Stefan was talking about, this shift toward a very transactional style of negotiating. I mean, where the US negotiates with Mexico to prevent people from arriving on our border, or Italy, I won't say it's negotiation, but they are supporting Libya to keep people from arriving in Europe. I mean, I think that it really goes to what Dulce was saying about the importance of individuals keeping people at the center of the story and not all these transactions of, you know, making deals. You keep people out, we'll give you so many dollars or euros. And, you know, so I think we really need to reclaim that space of talking about the individuals, the families that are separated, that have a basic human right to live with their family members.
You know, we have a question, I think, that sort of expands and dovetails off what you just said, Beth, and that's we'd love to hear how each of you is thinking about using personal narrative stories and also legal institutions and law and human rights normative standards to craft effective negotiation strategies in this migration space.
Yeah, I could start. Well, the DACA movement, I think it's just one example of how this has been done and so successfully, so that the polls were showing over 80% of Americans saw us as Americans, even though we've been undocumented since a child. So that actually worked so effectively that's the reason why the Trump administration wanted to use us as bargaining chips and why we didn't end up with protection for dreamers. That took collaboration with NGOs, with lawyers, and the private sector as well. You know, every report and data out there showed we were good for the economy. So the economy was not a reason to keep us out or deport us. And it very much became personal and about switching this narrative. And so when we would arrive to DC, the latest rounds of speaking to legislators was, yes, telling our stories and showing the data. But more than that, we thought we were already coming at that point in the last couple of years from a point of more power in the negotiation to be able to say, no, we're not going to accept that. This is not good for us. We're not going to take crumbs this time around, because DACA was a compromise, really. We were asking for comprehensive immigration reform for a long, long time. And all of the protests that were being done in these legislators' offices led to a failed negotiation in Congress where it was up for a bill and it didn't get voted on. And the compromise was DACA. Obama decided to do this through executive order. And here we are again, 2021, we've made great strides in telling our story and the movement has increased so much. But we're still today being used as bargaining chips. There are still, Republicans that say, no, we need more law. We need more border enforcement. We'll give you dreamers, but you got to give us something. And it's frustrating for those of us that are directly impacted by this, because I've been waiting for 33 years, and no matter what I do, I could be a business owner, a job creator, a property owner, and I'm still deportable. And no matter what I do, I keep hearing, well, I have to give more. And it's this idea of always wanting to give more and not really being respected, like my parents that have been with me 33 years here in the US, paying taxes. And so it's frustrating for those of us that are directly impacted to keep hearing this idea of being used as a negotiation tactic. And it's happening at the border with these folks that are being expelled. The excuse right now with the border closing is COVID, right? We have to protect the US because of COVID. Well, and that excuse is less and less powerful as more people are getting vaccinated and testing is very readily available. And as Stefan was saying, 2,000 people, it's really nothing in the grand scheme of things when there's over 1 million people migrating into the US every year. 2,000 people is something the US can very much do and can do it in an efficient way. And it could have done so within the 100 days of this administration. But there's always this, we have to give more, right? So yes, they are willing to accept people in, but then there's got to be increased militarization to keep the border, quote unquote, safer. And so it's a very frustrating idea that no matter, you know, how great we become in this, in trying to switch the narrative, there's always people on the other side asking for something else. And I don't have an answer for the question. I'm more than anything expressing frustration from this situation, because I do want to know what else can I do to get a path to citizenship in my lifetime. You know, I don't want to become a U.S. citizen once I'm dead, right? So what else can we do? And except keep going to DC and keep telling our stories and trying to convince the people that we're worth keeping here in the US, and that we don't need an increased militarization that is causing so much harm at our border, and trying to convince the other folks on the other side, the people that keep saying, well, you know, there's drugs, there's terrorism and all of these things, and try to open their eyes to this failed war on drugs and these other failed negotiations, so that they stop using those things as an excuse to stop those of us from obtaining citizenship in the US.
You know, Stefan mentioned that, you know, it's hard to negotiate with the spoiler in the room. And Dulce, you know, you discussed the fact that, and this, I think, came up with Beth and Stefan as well, that there's always a spoiler in the global room, as long as this sort of, you know, movement on the right has traction and is there to sort of put up resistance to framing this and responding to this as a humanitarian crisis. And I wonder, Beth and Stefan, if you, what your response is to Dulce's answer, like how can we, what answers do we have for negotiating with this spoiler, with the resistance that seems that it will always be there at this point?
It's a good question. I'm much older than Dulce, so I started with the International Committee of the Red Cross when I was 29, and now I'm over 60. So basically, I've been for more than 30 years in the humanitarian work, and it's a work made of, you know, big successes. And you know, the big successes is sometimes just one person, one family, but you really can influence and change the life of these people. The problem is that there is also incredible frustration. And the frustration is precisely linked to what I call the spoilers in the room, precisely because these people are everywhere. For example, you negotiate with a certain body, for example, a family reunification, and you have a head of section, which is basically preventing any of the staff to take an initiative which would be in the interest of the people. And you don't know how to deal with that person. The person is basically poisoning the whole thing. At the same time, maybe in exactly the same situation, you identify the right person who may have some influence on the bad boss and would in the end be able to take a positive decision for that specific person or that specific family. So this is the nature of humanitarian work. If you want to have big results, if you want to have huge numbers going the right direction, never do that. If you fundamentally believe that you can change the life for even one person with a lot of frustration, then you should do it. But yeah, I have been personally in situations where I was unable to find a solution and I was unable to unlock it. And I have been in other situations where I was able to really negotiate much more than what I was expecting. Sometimes through very, very discrete representation, sometimes by involving big shots intervening in our favor. In particular, when I was with UNHCR, when there were cases of refugees being at risk of being deported and in risk of refoulement. So yeah, it's frustrating to give you that answer, but I believe this is the reality.
Yeah, I might just comment on what Dulcie was saying about the importance and the power of personal stories. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons there's so much support for DACA recipients, is just hearing the stories of, you know, so many people who came here as children and what they've done. Sometimes I think there's a little danger in focusing on the exceptional achievements. You know, you should be a right to citizenship, not just because you're a doctor or you've been brilliant in university, but because you're a human being. I mean, I think we have to recognize that the right just to be normal, to be ordinary, is also really important. And it's also important to realize, particularly when working with refugees, that refugees aren't just their stories of despair and flight. I mean, they have lives and perspectives and can talk about other things. I don't know how many meetings I've been to where there's a token refugee on a panel who's expected to give his or her story, but not to contribute to whatever the issue is being discussed. You know, and I think we need to recognize that refugees, like all people, are multidimensional. They've got various roles and aspects they can talk about.
Beth, I have a question here from a participant to you. Did the Global Compact address provision of aid to the sending countries to address armed violence and other drivers of migration? And then secondly, is there any prospect now of the US joining the compact with the new administration?
There may be possibilities for the Biden administration to sign on to or to act in accordance with the compact. They're really not documents you join or sign, but I think that there are positive signals on that. You know, this was a political document. It was member states negotiating it. So there's some great general language about the need to prevent conflicts and address climate change and address drivers, but without getting specifics. It's when you get specific and you talk about what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen and what the US is doing to support Saudi Arabia and how many millions of people have been displaced, that it becomes very political. And so most of these documents don't name names of countries. To do so, you would never get approval.
Another participant is wondering what internal signals we're getting from the Biden administration on where they're headed on immigration policy, specifically with respect to refugees and asylum seekers. It's been hard to know what's been happening in the news coverage. And so is there room now for pushing for these more humane approaches? Are you seeing movement, like true movement?
I mean, yes, I think we are seeing some movement, and there is an openness. And you look at the immigration bill that Biden sent to Congress on his first day in office, has a lot of really good provisions. And yet, as Dulcie said, we're seeing a lot of really bad things happening on the border right now, that, you know, all adults are being sent back. Most European countries, you know, have also closed their borders, but have some provision for those seeking protection to go ahead and enter, and the US doesn't. I mean, I think that's unconscionable. You know, so there are some bad things happening at the same time. There are some positive signals. I think it's going to be up to advocates like Dulcie and ICMC and a bunch of other organizations to really push the administration to do what's right when it comes to immigration.
Yeah, I think the intentions are there to do better, but on the ground, as Beth was saying, there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's still a lot of rogue officers that don't want to follow what the Biden administration is doing. There have been unaccompanied minors that have been rejected at the port of entry and told to go to Chaparral, and then I've had to go and walk them over and say, no, your boss is saying that you're supposed to accept all accompanied minors. Here's a minor. And with a lot of pushback, finally they take them in. And it's these dialogues with the officers on the ground that indicate, you know, Biden still has a long ways to go to clean house. and to change the narrative. The policy from the top down might be, we no longer refer to migrants as illegal immigrants, and we refer to them as non-citizens. You know, to me, that was huge, because I know the importance of language and the rhetoric and how that empowers the officers on the ground to dehumanize someone, to even be violent with someone or abusive. And so rhetoric to me is everything. But then the officers on the ground might do something different, or the middle person, you know, might do other things. The Biden administration still has a chief of border patrol for the entire nation that was the chief of border patrol here in our region, and his rhetoric is one that creates fear of the other in his officers. When he talks about asylum seekers, he talks about, well, imagine somebody in your kitchen at 2 a.m. You know, they're invading your house, that's a crime. And that places fear in an officer that is armed, patrolling our border at 2 a.m. when they encounter migrants crossing the border. And so you can only imagine what goes on in that interaction. And so rhetoric to me is very important. And the Biden administration is doing much better, and they did so from day one. But there is still a lot of work to be done on the ground. You know, Title 42 is still in enforcement, even after 100 years. That has created so much pain on the asylum seekers that are in Tijuana right now. It's expelling them in very inhumane ways. So there's a lot of work to be done. The intention is there, but we need better in the execution of it. And we're still seeing the building of the wall in a lot of our border region here in San Diego. We're still seeing a lot of deaths. You know, people are still being funneled to their death, and we see an increase of maritime attempts to cross, and also death that comes with that. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and there is a lot of pushing that is going on by various NGOs to get the administration to treat people in a more humane way. I did not imagine it would require this much pushing. Based on what we heard from the campaign, I thought from day one things would be very, very different. And when I stepped into Tijuana 2 months ago, it was an eye-opener to me to realize I was not even aware the degree of harm that the policies that are still in place today was causing in our border region. And so there has been communication with the Biden administration, which is very different from Trump's administration, where there was zero communication with our NGOs. There was absolutely no negotiating there. The doors were completely closed to us. So at least this administration is in communication with us. We have meetings. We are on the phone, at least having some dialogue, which was non-existent with the Trump administration.
So I think it's kind of I know we're getting low on time here, but, you know, Stefan, I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in that distinction that you draw between an artificial crisis and a real crisis. And Dulce, you talk about the importance of language and how we discuss, you know, migrants and refugees. And so that, and we've discussed the word crisis. And so, Stefan, in terms of the distinction between a real crisis and artificial crisis, if we're still using the word crisis, are negotiations different, or are they the same under those two circumstances? Is the response the same if it's an artificial crisis, but it's nonetheless called a crisis?
In my view, they are very different. So maybe, I mean, we can make maybe a more subtle difference between a real crisis and an artificial one. But I mean, the example of Europe is quite telling in the sense that you can accept that, at least to some extent, 2015 was a crisis. Why? And you can check in the newspapers, in the European Union documents, in a number of documents from member states, the word crisis is still being used today. So basically in 2021, with the lowest number in 2020, in large part because of the COVID-19 crisis, where the number of arrival is 1/10 of what happened in 2015. But we are still in that rhetoric and that narrative which has been imposed to us. And it's extremely difficult just to say, come on, let's try to reflect a little bit. Can we still talk about a crisis when you have less than 100,000 people arriving in the whole Mediterranean for the full year? The answer of a reasonable person is no. It's no longer a crisis. The problem is that because we still have the language of a crisis, the capacity, for example, to discuss with governments policies, to basically start discussing, for example, regular pathways for migrants, to have a bit of a more visionary approach to migration. This is not possible. We are still negotiating boats with 200 people. We are still negotiating that more than 5 or 6 European countries are ready to accept the arrivals. So most of the European countries are against European solidarity. So that's where we are currently in Europe. So yes, it is very, very different to negotiate in a kind of a normal situation or in a crisis, whether the crisis is real or artificial, as it is the case today in Europe.
Thank you. Well, I am mindful of the fact that it is 10:30, but also I could speak to the three of you all day. This has just been a real privilege to host you and to have this conversation. It's been very rich, and I've learned a lot from all of you. And I hope everyone here joins me in thanking our panel. Before we leave, I'd like to just very quickly share my screen to show you a couple of events that we have coming up. Are we seeing, can you see my screen? Did I do this right? No, you cannot. Okay. Let's see. How is that? Okay, good, great. On June 7, 8, 14, and 15, we have a virtual negotiation intensive course. It's 3.5 hours a day on those 4 days. On June 30th, we will be hosting our next roundtable, Israel-Palestine, the future of people-to-people peace building. And then as a sort of chapter 2 to that roundtable on August 4th, we'll be hosting an Israel-Palestine Youth Voices on the Future of Peace Building roundtable. And then with hopes that the world is open and normal again next fall, we have a live workshop scheduled, 2-day negotiation intensive workshop in Boston. All of these can be found on our website, cambridgenegotiationinstitute.com/courses. And now I'm going to see if I can undo this, but thank you so much to our panelists. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and to